Hi, it's Penny here, and today I want to talk about some books that have high average ratings on Goodreads, but I don't feel like people talk about them enough. Maybe people do outside of my circles, but in my circles I don't see them talked about enough, so I want to talk about them as well. So these are books that I noticed while I was recently filming a couple of videos I put up about overrated and underrated books on Goodreads, but these are ones where they've got high ratings and I think they deserve them. So I have also divided these into 4 categories, so I will leave timestamps down below if you want to jump to a particular one for whatever reason. And I'm going to start with the standalones. I will say I see a lot of people saying that they wish there were more standalones out there, especially fantasy people. And I really think that if that's you, then science fiction might be the answer. You should consider science fiction because 2 of the 3 of these are science fictions. And I just think fantasy is very heavy in series. In fact, most of the other books on this list are fantasy in their series. But let's start with the standalones. So firstly, I'm going to talk about Exhalation by Ted Chiang. I do see people raving about Ted Chiang sometimes, but I think the only reason he isn't talked about much is that he hasn't released that much, or at least he's released 2 short story anthologies. He has written a lot of short stories, obviously, because there's 2 anthologies worth, but these are just really amazing, like mind-expanding science fiction short stories. Sometimes I do find some of them a little bit intellectually challenging, but other ones not so much, so like don't be afraid. And he writes them in a way like they feel real. It's very hard to describe, but they just feel like tangible stories that could really be happening. So I won't tell you what all the stories in this anthology are about, but I'll tell you a couple. So the title story, Exhalation, is about these robots that are powered by air and they start realizing that they're malfunctioning, and we're following along with one particular robot as he tries to diagnose the problem. There's also a really great one from the perspective of a parrot, basically saying, why are humans always looking in space for other intelligent life when they could just be looking at the parrots? I love that one. It's beautiful. And then the longest story in the anthology is The Life Cycle of Software Objects, which basically follows these digital pets that basically have become intelligent life, and then it's asking the question, what happens when these digital pets start to become obsolete, or like there's more advanced technology that's better than them? That one's quite emotional as well, actually. So if you like short story anthologies, or even if you don't, because I often don't, but I love Ted Chiang's ones. Then I also have one by a New Zealand author, so that's This Other World by A.C. Buchanan. I actually really need to reread this one because I know I recommend it all the time, but it's been a while since I've read it, and I'd really like to reread it. So this is about an older woman, and she lives on this other planet, or this other world, and she's autistic, and she just really finds that she fits in much better in this other world's culture. But then there is like some kind of like political conspiracy, murder, mystery thing going on that she gets involved with. And it's just really well written, really interesting. I really love it. Then lastly, the fantasy standalone that I want to recommend is The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater. So I know a lot of people really love The Raven Cycle by Maggie Stiefvater, but I don't see people often talking about her other works. And I think if you like The Raven Cycle for the weird, magical, fantastical stuff, then I think you'll like her other stuff. I do think if you like The Raven Cycle specifically for the friend group, then maybe not so much. But The Scorpio Races is just a really beautiful Irish-inspired fantasy where on this island these horses come out of the sea once a year, and the people on the island basically capture a horse and participate in the race. And we're following this girl who's the first girl to ever enter the race, and also this boy, and both of them need to win the race in order to kind of secure their future. It's a beautiful story about these young people just struggling to figure out how they're going to survive and overcoming a bunch of challenges to get there. Okay, all the rest of the ones I'm going to talk about are series, but firstly I'm going to talk about series where the first book in the series kind of had a weak start. The average rating isn't as high, like it isn't over 4, which is what I'm generally counting as high in this video. But then the later books in the series are over 4, and so I think you shouldn't judge the series too much on the first book. You should keep going, even though I actually think I liked the first books in all these series. But anyway, the first series I'm going to talk about I actually have physically, and that is the Lady Astronaut series by Mary Robinette Kowal. So the first book, The Calculating Stars, only had an average rating of 3.97. That's still very high. But then the latest book, The Relentless Moon, is up to 4.37. So this follows a world where basically in the 60s a meteor hit Earth, and the scientists know that that means in the next 20 or so years, Earth is no longer going to be inhabitable. So they ramp up the space program to try and get off Earth. And we're following a bunch of women who are involved in being the first lady astronauts. Most of them do have pilot experience, but also a bunch of them are mathematicians. These books also deal with a lot of other themes. In the first book, our main character struggles quite a lot with anxiety. Oh, and the second book follows the same character, but is more focused on a mission to Mars. And then the third one, basically they've set up a colony on the moon, and we're following this woman who struggles with anorexia, but also her husband is a candidate to become the next president. They're dealing with a lot of like conspiracy theorists. Obviously the world is falling apart very similarly, to be honest, to the way it is now with all the climate change problems we're having. And there's a kind of a religious political group saying that they shouldn't be spending so much money on the space program, they should be focusing on helping the people on Earth, and they're trying to sabotage these space missions. So I really love this story. I think a lot of the themes are very relevant today. In fact, in this Relentless Moon as well, it's set at the time of the polio outbreak, and there's a lot of talk about vaccination and just people doubting whether polio is a real thing, whether the vaccination can be trusted. So like throughout these books, the themes are very relevant to today, and they're just written, I want to say, like quite matter-of-factly. What I really like is even though the main characters struggle with things, they're very sensible. And I like that. And I think there is going to be at least one more book in this series to look forward to. Oh, I think I forgot to say also lots of themes around feminism and racism. Honestly, it's great. It's great. Then the next series I want to talk about is one by Charlaine Harris. So Charlaine Harris is mostly well known for writing the Sookie Stackhouse series, which was the inspiration for the True Blood TV series. And like that series is okay, it does have its problems, but I actually really like this spin-off series. The first book being Midnight Crossroads. Basically this is set in a small town of Midnight, which is a small town at some crossroads, where we have a few like strange characters. There's a woman called Fiji who's a witch. There's a guy called, been a little while since I read this, Manfred, who's like a psychic, like an online psychic. And there's some other town residents who run like the local restaurant or the local service station. And there's like a retirement home there as well, and an op shop type thing which is run by a vampire, a really old vampire, because the vampires in this are the same as the vampires from the Sookie Stackhouse series. And we do get a couple of cameos in this series from Sookie Stackhouse characters, but really I would say this is almost cozy fantasy. Almost. There is some murder mysteries going on, I guess similar to the Sookie Stackhouse series, but like it's just this small town and these inhabitants trying to figure out what's going on, but also just trying to live their best life. I really enjoyed it. This first book does only have an average rating of 3.73, which is almost on the border of not a good rating. But the second book has an average rating of 4, and then the third book has an average rating of 4.1. So it gets better. It gets better. I really had a good time with it. Then lastly, I want to talk about the Magisterium series by Holly Black and Cassandra Clare. So I think the reason that a lot of people haven't enjoyed this series as much is that they think it's a bit of a Harry Potter ripoff. And it is true. It's set at a magic school, and we have this boy who is the chosen one, but his father has always raised him to believe that magic is bad and that he shouldn't ever talk to any wizards. So he's been kind of separated, like Harry Potter, separated from the magical community, but now he's learning about it, but also learning about what the deal is with him being a chosen one. And there is a similar kind of Voldemort character, but the way that they're connected I thought was really interesting, and the way that it investigates some concepts around like death and immortality. Again, I thought it was really interesting. I think it's a little bit darker actually than Harry Potter, and I really liked some of them. Like I actually thought Harry Potter, a lot of the magic is just built off more classical magical stuff, even though it is very creative at times. I'm not really a very big J.K. Rowling fan these days, so I think you should forget Harry Potter and read the Magisterium series instead. Also, it's not as like long and padded out as Harry Potter. So the first book only has an average rating of 3.95, but then the rest of the books do have average ratings over 4. So I think if you're looking for a book that's like Harry Potter but not Harry Potter and maybe investigates a few dark themes around death and immortality, this is one to try. Okay, then my next category is going to be series spin-offs. So quite often I see a very popular series and then the author will write like a spin-off, or actually one of these is just a sequel, and people won't read the spin-off or talk about the spin-off, even though I think they're just as good, if not better. So the first one of these I'm going to talk about is the Argosy series, which is a spin-off from the Spellslinger series. In fact, on Goodreads, I just had a look at it on my laptop. On Goodreads, it's listed as like prequel, like 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, rather than as its own series, which actually, preparing for this video, I discovered I thought this was a duology, just 2 little prequel books. There's a 3rd one coming out, and given that the Spellslinger series is 7 books long, maybe there's going to be even more, and that would be amazing because I think the Argosy books are even better than the Spellslinger books. Now, admittedly, I think a lot of people read the 1st or 2nd book in the Spellslinger series and didn't necessarily like them. My suggestion would be that if you were interested in that series, even if you didn't love it, you might still want to try the Argosy series because it's better. It's better. And I think you could read them in either order. Like, it's a prequel series, but it doesn't completely spoil the main series. So Spellslinger, if you don't know, is about this young boy, and he's been preparing for his magic exams, except just before his exams, his magic disappears. And in discovering what's going on with that, he ends up kind of going out into the world on a bit of an adventure. And the thing I loved about the Spellslinger series the most, did I love it or did it frustrate me? I think both. Every book basically has a whole new magic system because every part of the world does magic in a slightly different way. Some of those different kinds of magic were really interesting, others less so, and also sometimes I was frustrated because I wanted more of what we got in the previous book, but then we just moved on. But anyway, what I was really amazed with is after 7 books of introducing new magic systems every time, the Argosy series, it does more. It's amazing, but also it's a much more emotional journey. So we're following this woman named Farius Parfax who comes along and kind of takes this guy under his wing and helps him on his adventures. So this prequel series is kind of showing her childhood and how she became the woman that she becomes. And she is one of the Argosy, which are kind of like traveling nomads who have a very particular view of the world, kind of like traveling philosophers. I love them and I love learning more about them. Also, the magic that you get, I think in the 2nd book of this series, it was really amazing. I loved it. It was so twisty. And there's this other Argosy woman that she has a really interesting relationship with. I loved it a lot. I do recommend it. The 1st book has an average rating of 4.26 and the 2nd one is 4.4. So like, totally worth giving it a go. Then I also already mentioned Maggie Stiefvater, but I want to mention her again because again, so many people have read and loved the Raven Cycle, but I don't see many people, or as many people, picking up the Dreamers trilogies. This is like the spin-off series from the Raven Cycle. I will admit, again, I think it's the case of if you like the weird magic stuff and like Maggie Stiefvater's very specific writing style, then I think you will love the Dreamers trilogy. But if you were only there in the Raven Cycle for the friend group, the friend group isn't really there in the Dreamers trilogy. It mainly follows one of our characters, Ronan, and his brothers and kind of these new friends that he meets that are involved in this dreaming type situation. So mostly the series is all about these people who have magic and this other group of people that believe that these magic people are going to be responsible for the end of the world. So they're going around hunting them all down and killing them. But it goes in such strange directions. I will admit that I was a little bit disappointed that it's ended and Maggie Stiefvater says she's not really planning to write anymore in the world. I think there's still so much more potential to be explored. So that's a bit disappointing, but I still think just the ideas that are in it are totally worth reading it for. Also, like that's asking you to read a whole nother trilogy. But something else that I thought was weird that no one ever mentioned is this little short story, Opal, that Maggie Stiefvater wrote that kind of goes between those 2 series. And this is just about, I guess it's hard to talk about it, but there's a character in the Raven Cycle called Opal. She's a young girl that isn't entirely real, and it's just kind of a little bit of her life, and you get little snippets of Adam and Ronan and what they're up to. But it's just a very fantastical, dream-like story. Very short, and if you like the Raven Cycle, like, you should read it just for a little bit more of the Raven Cycle stuff. And it does have an average rating of 4.13, so why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? Then lastly, I talked about this recently. I want to talk about the sequel to Strange the Dreamer. Strange the Dreamer is a really popular book, or it was when it first came out. It's been a while now, so less people are talking about it, but still, you do see people mention Strange the Dreamer somewhat often. What I have seen people say a little bit recently, though, is that they still haven't read the sequel. And why would you not have read the sequel if you love Strange the Dreamer? you're definitely missing out. So Muse of Nightmares is the one I'm talking about. It has an average rating of 4.43, which is pretty high. Admittedly, it has some parts with the original characters from Strange the Dreamer, and then it has some new characters introduced. I think when I first picked up Muse of Nightmares, I was a little bit put off by the fact that it didn't start with the characters that I was expecting, but I came to love the new characters, and I just think Strange the Dreamer doesn't wrap things up at all. So you need to read Muse of Nightmares to get like bigger context of what's going on, but also get more of those characters' stories. So if you haven't heard about Strange the Dreamer, basically it's following this young boy who has become obsessed with the city of Weep. Now, Weep is a city that basically people have forgotten everything about, even the name. That's why they now just call it Weep. And he ends up kind of going along on a quest with some other people trying to find out what's happened with this city. It's a really beautiful story. It has a little romantic subplot, which even I didn't mind. And just the magical elements are really interesting. And then Muse of Nightmares takes it even further. The writing style is beautiful. You should read it. Then lastly, I want to talk about 3 series where the series have not been continued and I would like them to be. And these books are all really amazing, very high rated, so you should read them. And hopefully, if more people read them and rave about them and talk about them, then there will be some more motivation for the author and the publishers to like continue the series. I doubt that I'm a big enough booktuber to have any kind of influence on this, but really, I'm always hopeful we'd get more from these series. So firstly, I'm going to talk about The Rhythmatist by Brandon Sanderson. This is a middle grade series where the magic is like chalk based. So there are these chalk based monsters that attack, and we're at the school where children learn to do chalk based circles as defenses and like draw their own little chalk based monsters. Sounds a little bit ridiculous, but it's Brandon Sanderson, so he makes it real. And we're basically following this boy who thought he would become one of these people who has the ability to draw these chalk diagrams, but unfortunately he's not good enough. He doesn't get in. And then we're kind of following along with what happens after that. I really liked it. Admittedly, the teenage boy is a little bit annoying, and even the characters come across as quite younger than they're supposed to be, so it's not perfect, but it's like a crime that Brandon Sanderson, who's so great at continuing series, has not continued this one. Admittedly, he has a lot of other stuff going on, but come on Brandon, you can do it. Another author that's always writing is Victoria Schwab, and I really loved her archive series. I have this bind up, which is the first and second book bound up as The Dark Vault, but there was talk of a third book, and Victoria did say that she had outlined it, but just it doesn't fit into her schedule to write it. And I'm sure that's because not enough people are raving about this and talking about it. If enough people were, maybe she would be motivated to continue the series. And I think a third book could be really great. I didn't think the second book was as good, but honestly, what do I know, because the average rating is even higher than the first book. It is a YA series, and we're following this young girl who is, what is her name? What is it? Oh, a librarian. So basically in this world there is this library of the dead, or like the dead are called histories and they rest in the archive, but sometimes these histories try to escape, and she basically has this key which allows her to go into the archive and protect the archive from the real world and the real world from the archive. There's also a lot of themes about dealing with grief because she has family members in the archive, and I just thought it was a really beautiful story investigating some interesting themes, and I can't believe we haven't got a third book. Terrible. Another one that I can't understand why we haven't got a third book is the Six World series by Rebecca Roanhorse. So this is kind of like an urban fantasy, kind of paranormal romance, but like the romance is light. It's more about the plot. So we're following this woman who lives in this apocalyptic world. Some people have these magical powers that they've kind of like inherited from their tribal lines. I'm not sure if those are the right words to use. Again, it's been a while since I've read this series because it's been a while since the last book was released. First 2 have been released and I really love them. The main character Mags is such a badass. Like if you like apocalyptic paranormal fantasy, I think you'll like this. Like if you like the Kate Daniels series, which is one of my favorites, I think you'll like this one. It's really great. But Rebecca Roanhorse has been focusing more on like the, what's the series called? The Black Sun series. And like that's also a great series, but not as good as the Six World series. So I need you all to read this series and rave about it so that she could get back to this series. And honestly, I think more people would like the Six World series than the Black Sun series, so I'm confused. I'm confused why that one's the focus. Anyway, that is all the books that I have on my list that are high rated, and I don't think enough people talk about them. Let me know if you've read any of them, if you disagree with their high rating or my opinion of them. Also, let me know if there's any other books that you think are really great that don't get talked about enough. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.